Namaskar, this is Shivangi Mukherjee and you're watching an episode of Bharat, the Forgotten Chapters. There is a simple rule in geopolitics. The space you leave behind unattended will eventually be occupied by someone else. And nowhere is that lesson more important for Bharat than Tibet. India and Tibet were never strangers. For centuries, the two shared deep cultural and religious ties through Buddhism. But after China established control over Tibet, the geography between India and China changed dramatically. And what makes the story more interesting is that India had a historical basis for its position on Tibet that went back decades before communist China came into existence. To understand that, we have to go back to 1914. At Shimla, British India and Tibet negotiated a convention that produced what became known as the McMahon Line, the boundary between Tibet and British India in the eastern sector. China refused to sign that final convention. For India, however, the Shimla Convention became an important foundation of its position on its eastern frontier. In fact, from India's perspective, it gave New Delhi a stronger historical basis for its relationship with Tibet than China could claim at the time. Then came 1949. Mao's communist forces won the Chinese Civil War. And Beijing now had a very different vision for Tibet. Tibet was strategically priceless. It was the roof of Asia, the source region for some of the continent's great rivers and a vast mountainous region connecting China with South Asia. So in 1950, the People's Liberation Army moved into Tibet. And here is where independent India's major dilemma begins. India had just become independent. The country was trying to integrate hundreds of princely states, rebuild an economy devastated by colonial rule, and deal with a war with Pakistan. The military itself had just been divided between India and Pakistan. So was India in a position to fight another major power in the Himalayas? Probably not. But there was another problem. New Delhi badly wanted to believe that China could become a friendly Asian power. When the People's Liberation Army began its advance into Tibet, China did not even feel the need to properly inform India beforehand. India's ambassador in Beijing, K.M. Panikkar, was not given advance information about China's plans for the annexation. Now think about that for a moment. India was sitting right next door, sharing centuries of cultural and religious ties with Tibet. And Beijing essentially proceeded as though New Delhi did not need to be in the room. India condemned China's stance on Tibet, but when Tibet tried to appeal to the United Nations, New Delhi stopped short of aggressively sponsoring the Tibetan cause. And this is where Nehru was criticized for the role he played in it. He did not support pushing the Tibetan cause at the United Nations. You see, India wanted a friend at the border, and so it made Communist China's cause for being recognized as a P5 nation at the UN instead. New Delhi was walking a diplomatic tightrope. It wanted to protect India's interests and Tibet's autonomy without pushing China completely into the hostile camp. From today's perspective, that caution can look like a terrible bargain. But remember the India of 1950. This country was barely 3 years old, dealing with partition, integrating hundreds of princely states, recovering from a war with Pakistan, and trying to build a functioning military and economy from scratch. India also did not want to unnecessarily antagonize the Soviet Union. The USSR and China both shared a communist regime and saw each other as friends. Russia has always been an important defense and strategic partner for India, and Tibet was not India's only concern either. Beijing was beginning to build influence in Nepal. Nepal holds the key to the north of India. Plus, the Korean War had begun. The Cold War was hardening. India was surrounded by a rapidly changing Asian strategic landscape. So while New Delhi was trying to keep the Himalayan situation stable, Beijing was gradually expanding its influence. And this is the great irony. India wanted to preserve its centuries-old relationship with Tibet and hoped Tibet's distinctive political, cultural, and religious identity would survive. China, on the other hand, wanted Tibet under its direct control. India hesitated. China consolidated. And then came 1959. The Dalai Lama fled Tibet and crossed into India. India gave him asylum. That decision changed Indian history. Because from that moment on, Tibet's political and cultural identity did not disappear. It simply relocated. The Dalai Lama and thousands of Tibetans built a life in India. Monasteries, schools, communities, and the Tibetan government in exile took root. Dharamshala became one of the world's most important centers of Tibetan culture. So yes, China might have taken control of Tibet, but India helped preserve Tibet's spirit. The first was a geopolitical reality, the second an Indian achievement. And look at the difference between then and now. In 2017, when the Dalai Lama travelled to Arunachal Pradesh, despite China's objections, India did not simply ask Beijing for permission. New Delhi, under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, made its position clear. Arunachal Pradesh is an integral part of India, and the Dalai Lama is a revered religious figure. In July 2026, the Prime Minister publicly wished the Dalai Lama on his birthday, praising the message of peace and harmony. And that matters. You know why? Because diplomacy is not only about tanks and treaties. Sometimes it's also about who refuses to let a civilization disappear. For decades, Tibetans have preserved their language, religion, and traditions on Indian soil. Tibet matters to India for another critical reason: water. Tibet is the source region of major rivers flowing into South Asia. India is a lower riparian country, China is an upper riparian. This puts India at a disadvantage. Dams like the Three Gorges and the Zangbu built by China have been environmentally depleting Tibet. India has repeatedly raised concerns about downstream interests. After China took over Tibet, it has been transformed by massive infrastructure, hydropower, and resource extraction. The environmental consequences don't stop at China's border. What happens on the Tibetan plateau can eventually affect the rivers, ecology, and communities downstream in India and Bangladesh. So Tibet is no longer merely a question of history. It's a question of security, water, and geography. China, entrenched in Tibet, can put enormous strategic pressure on India's northeast. Have a look at the map. India's northeast is connected to the rest of the country through a narrow Siliguri corridor, a powerful adversary controlling the Tibetan plateau. Building infrastructure and applying pressure along India's northern and eastern borders can make India's geography considerably more vulnerable. Which is why going soft on China's strategic ambitions has already taught India some very expensive lessons. We cannot afford to repeat them. It may seem today that Tibet is a lost cause to India, but the Tibet blooming inside India might force you to think differently. India has history, geography, a living Tibetan community, the Dalai Lama, a cultural influence, and the moral credibility of having given refuge when Tibet needed it most. Those are assets. And in geopolitics, you don't casually throw away your assets. So the question for India today is this: will India continue to keep the Tibetan cause alive? Because Beijing wants the world to forget that Tibet ever had a distinct political and cultural identity. India can ensure that the world does not. India has already done something extraordinary. When Tibetans were forced to leave their homeland, India opened its doors. When their culture was under pressure, India gave them space to preserve it. When the Dalai Lama needed refuge, India gave him refuge. That is why India's relationship with Tibet is not merely a chapter of foreign policy. It is a part of India's own civilizational story. And as India approaches another Independence Day, perhaps the lesson from Tibet is simple. You cannot change yesterday's map, but you can decide what to do with the strategic advantages that history has left you. If you've stayed until this far, I have a question for you. In what year did the Dalai Lama seek shelter in India? If you know the answer, leave it down below in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.